Welcome to Real Talk, where I give real answers to real questions from real worship leaders. If you have your own question, head right here after this video and submit it, and it might be on a future episode. Got some good questions this week. Let's talk about it. I've recently come on as a worship leader in my church, and I've been growing so much. The one thing I worry about is some congregants feel like worship overall across the church is too much like a performance, that they are watching rather than being invited in and praising together as a body of believers. I think some of this stems from the fact that some members have been attending for a longer time, yet feel like they are still newcomers in the eyes of our leadership. We are a bigger multi-campus church that has been struggling with these things. Any tips to think about as I continue to lead? First of all, golf clap for you recognizing the problem and that this is something that you need to address, because sometimes worship leaders don't even realize that it's not a performance. Like, they think that their job is to get up there, and if they sing well enough and do things well enough, then worship happened this morning. But I assume you've watched some of my videos, like the one that I put out about biblical corporate worship, which I will link in the description down below. If you haven't checked out that video, check that out, because that's exactly what this person is talking about. They're talking about how worship is not a performance at all. That's kind of why I don't like special music in the church, because so often, more times than not, I think it is a performance where people, and by performance, I don't mean that the person on stage is necessarily like, everybody look at me, but whenever we do special music, we're saying, watch this person sing this song, listen to them sing this song, when I think what we find in the Bible is that when we join together in corporate worship, we are actually supposed to be worshiping together, and it's not just one person doing all the work up front, and you're supposed to sit there and reflect. So you understand this, and I appreciate that about you. How do you teach your church that? How do you get them to see that? And I very intentionally used the word teach, because this is 100% teaching. Well, I'll say it's 75% teaching and 25% action. If this is important to you, which I can tell that it is, then you need to be all about this for the next 3 months, maybe 6 months, and teach it to your church over and over and over again, and constantly remind them. And since you're leading in a multi-campus environment, train your other worship leaders to work this into the conversation as well as they lead their campus of your church. And it should be a unified effort. If this is really important to you, like if you want people to take hold of this, not just at your church, but at the other campuses in your church, make sure that you're not the only one doing it, and get other people on board and teach them the things that I've taught you. You don't even have to give me credit, because it's not about me getting credit, but if you want to send them one of my videos to explain what I'm talking about, then feel free to do that. But just constantly put it in front of your other worship leaders as well, so that they can be a part of it. So whenever you get in front of your church on Sunday morning, always be intentional. Like, don't skirt around the issue. You can literally say, in these moments, this is not just the band playing and me singing. The beauty in this moment is us singing together, Colossians 3:16, letting the word of Christ dwell in us richly, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, with gratitude in our heart to God. And then you teach them, like, in this moment, it is your responsibility to sing these songs to each other, because in that we are taught and admonished. And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people walk into the church and they just have no idea that that's the case. They think, I can just sit in the chairs, I can just stand when the worship leader tells me to stand, and everything will be okay. And then I'm worshiping because I heard Christian music on Sunday. And so the first thing is invite people to participate. Now, the second thing is be very honest. And maybe, this is the good part about serving in a large church, is that you can get people where it's not just your own opinion, but you can actually bring people in to get their opinion as well. And so be brutally honest with yourself. What do the times of worship that you plan communicate? Are they communicating that we are to worship together? Or are they communicating the band's going to play a couple songs now, and you can sing along if you want, but you don't really have to? Now, how do we perhaps unintentionally, but how do we communicate those things to our church? And I understand different environments for different people, but one of the things, I'll say it because I always say it, is the keys that you're singing in. Now, if you're serving in a larger church and there's like 500 people at your gathering, I think keys matter a little bit less, actually, because you're in a larger context and people will sing out more because there's overall more volume in the room. But keys are still important. And so just think, like, if I am just picking keys that allow my vocalists to sing the best they possibly can, am I providing room for my church to sing along? Or am I just reinforcing the idea that, hey, this person, as long as they can sing really well, worship is going to happen? That's one of the things that I would look at. Number two, and this is a touchy subject even for me because I'm not 100% sure how I feel about it yet, but the lighting in your church. What does the lighting in your church communicate? And I think that there is a gray area here. It's not we have to have all the lights on or we have to have all the lights off. I think there's space in between where the lights can still be dimmed. But what do you communicate when your stage is lit up as bright as it can possibly be and the room that you're worshiping in is pitch black? I've been to a church or two in my time where I walked in after the service started. I'd just come in from outside and I walked in and I was looking around for a chair and I literally could not even see the chairs in front of me. I felt like a blind man. I was like going to walk up to the front to be healed from blindness, right? Because it was so dark in there. I was like, if I can't see to find my way to a chair, what is being communicated? What's being communicated is, hey, this is a time for you to shut out every distraction around you and have you and God time. And this is going back to what I talked about before. Check out that video down in the description below about biblical corporate worship. But when we are gathered together to worship, we are gathered together to worship. We should be aware that there are other people in the room. We should be aware that there's a crying baby 3 rows in front of us to the left. We should be aware of the older couple who's scowling on their face a couple rows in front of us. We should be aware of the older couple behind us who's exuberant because they have had a vibrant worship life their entire life, right? We should be aware of these things, and it's okay, and it's not a distraction, because that's the point of us getting together to worship, because only once we see those people can we teach and admonish them. So another thing to think about, the lighting in your room, and I'll leave that up to your judgment. Like I said, I'm not hard and fast one way or the other, but the more that I've led, the more I've wanted the lights to be up a little bit more in my room than just pitch black. And then I guess just one more thing to think about is, what are the elements in your service? How are you leading those moments? Are you leading them in a way where you are inviting people in, or are you leading them in a way where they are a little bit performative? And maybe that's not your intention behind it, but I brought it up before, special music, right? Like, we don't want it to be performative. So I just had this conversation with my pastor. For Christmas Eve, he suggested a song for me to do that was not a song that my church knows, not a song that we do. And he was like, it's really going to tie in to the message. And I've just really been on this kick right now that when we worship together. So I was telling him, like, I just feel like that's not the right thing to do, to come out of the message when people are primed to respond to the truth that they just heard. And then we're like, just kidding. We're going to do a song. We just want you to sit back and listen to it. It's like, no, people are ready to respond. And I've seen churches before that do that on a regular basis, where they have the song coming out of the message, or even a song during the service, where it's like, just sit back and relax and watch and reflect. And I'm not saying that those moments can't be worshipful. I'm just not 100% convinced that they are the kind of worship that we should be doing in a corporate worship gathering, because we can do those moments of worship on our own. The uniqueness of the corporate gathering is that we worship together. So I say all that because I feel like you know what I'm talking about, but I think you need to be brutally honest with what your services are communicating. And don't just answer it yourself, but get other people's opinions on it and have an honest conversation around that. And only then can you start to shape your services in a way that invite people in instead of them just seeing you as performing on stage. So, first of all, 75% teaching. Definitely teach your church that is the case, but then make sure that your actions match the teaching and that you are being very intentional about it. You mentioned modeling worship, which is great and correct. I have a problem. The head deacon of the church, who also had a hand in hiring me, sings on my worship team. He sings off-key about 30 to 40% of the time. I presented him with some exercises to work on, and he took that well, but it's still off. The other thing is, in the summertime, he sings up in front of the worship service in a pair of shorts and flip-flops. I'm all for casual. I just don't think that shorts and flip-flops is what you stand up with in front of a service. I don't want to be let go, but I mean, how many of these things am I going to tell this person about? Let's add the other fact that the pastor's wife wants to sing with us and has gotten up 4 times. I don't think she can sing on key, even with exercises. Yeah, it's the pastor's wife. What do I do? Most common question I get is, there's somebody on my worship team who shouldn't be on there. How do I get them off? Add to that, in this question, not only is it somebody who's on your worship team who shouldn't be on the worship team, it's the person who hired you, and it's the pastor's wife, complicating things even more. Or does it? I feel like on the surface, it seems like it complicates it more, but at the end of the day, I feel like our response should still be the same. And it is more complicated because it's a harder decision to make when you're in that situation, but I don't think that it changes what should happen. Or at least what you need to say. I think you've done good so far. You've given these people things to work on, and I think you just keep holding them to that standard and not being afraid to tell them how things are actually. Not being afraid to tell them, I just don't think you're there musically. I don't care if you're the pastor's wife. I don't care if you're the person who hired me. You hired me to do a job to create a worship ministry that thrives on excellence, and you are not an excellent musician. I obviously wouldn't say it that way, but essentially that's what you're saying. Like, if I hired somebody to do a job and then I tried to weasel myself into that position, I would want them to still do their job even with me. I would want them to tell me if I wasn't doing what I needed to be doing. Let's say I ran a company and I had somebody who wrote sales copy for me, and I was like, you know what? I know I hired you to write sales copy, but guess what? I'm actually going to type something up because I think that I'm better at it than you, subconsciously or quietly, secretively. So I write something up. I wouldn't want them to tell me, hey, your sales copy is really, really good. That you get a thumbs up. I had hired them to improve the sales copy of my company. And so I want them to tell me that my sales copy is bad so that it can be fixed. That's what a good boss should do. Same thing in the church. Your boss, the person who hired you, which I assume your boss would be more of your pastor, but I don't know how it's structured in your church. But either way, I mean, same thing goes for your pastor's wife, I guess. Like, I would want my boss to trust me in the position that I'm in, even if I'm telling them, hey, this isn't where it needs to be. And I think that that's the conversation that you can have is like, you hired me for this job. And I have said this to one of my pastors before. You've hired me for this job. I know you don't agree with the decision that I'm making, but this is my responsibility, so I need you to trust me in it. And I think that that is a perfectly valid conversation to have. Be careful with how you have it, but it is still a conversation that can be had and should be had, I think. You hired me to do this job. I'm going to do this job, so do you trust me to do it? I'm not saying I'll never listen to any of your opinions, but on this one thing, I really feel strongly about this. And that is how an organization is supposed to function. Just because you're a person is over you in leadership doesn't mean that they have direct control on every single decision that you make. They might oversee you, but they should still be trusting you to make the decisions that need to be made. So what do? You keep bringing it up with the people that it needs to be brought up with and not shy away from it just because they are in a position of leadership. I know that it feels awkward, but what are you going to do when somebody else who joins your worship team can't sing? And then they're like, listen, I know that guy over there can't sing either, so why aren't you talking to him? Then it becomes even more complicated, right? So just treat everybody the same. If something needs fixed, make sure that it gets fixed. We have a sister in church, co-founder, and she is just the busiest person and is forever always encouraging the others to develop, but it is always having a piece in every pie, and that irritates and turns the youngsters away. How do I go about it? Because I feel obligated to do something, but not sure how. I mean, this just sounds like the classic, I helped start the church, and now I'm having trouble relinquishing responsibilities that were probably necessary at one time. I think that sometimes we forget that whenever we look at a leader in the church who we think does too much. That's because at one time, them doing all of those things was probably necessary because there wasn't anybody else to do those things. The hard part is that now the church has grown to a point where they don't need to be doing all of those things, and they don't want to give those things up, or they're finding it hard to give those things up. So what can you do? It's not a, listen, you need to stop doing all this stuff conversation, because what happens is we tell people that. We say, you shouldn't be doing all this stuff. And the question is in their head, and probably rightfully so most of the time, is who's going to do it if I don't do it? It needs to be done, and nobody's going to do it if I don't do it, and so I'll just keep doing it. And so the solution is not to tell them to stop doing all this stuff. The solution is to help them find people who can do the things that they don't need to be doing. And it sounds like there are those people in your church, and so you need to connect them with this lady so that she can see that there are people who can take over those responsibilities and do them. And that way you're coming alongside her and saying, listen, I know that there is a lot on your plate right now. Look, this guy over here, he can do it and he wants to do it. So let's talk to him about it. And I think that's how the exchange of things happen. Because a lot of times people, I think deep down, they don't really want to be doing all of these things, but the bigger fear is that if they don't do it, then it's not going to get done. And so if you can show them that it's still going to get done, then and prove it to them, then they will back away from it and let somebody else take over. At least a healthy person will. And so if you're just, a person on the worship team, I'm not sure what your position is, but there are leadership structures in the church, and I feel like, we should be able to talk to a pastor or somebody in the church about these things. But at the end of the day, it's a leadership issue, and it might not even be your issue to address, depending on your position in the church. I don't know what your position is or what your relationship with this person is, but sometimes it's not our responsibility to address these things. We can point it out to them, but at the end of the day, it's not like we can tell our pastor how to run the church. So just approach it cautiously, but really try to show them that there are other people who can take over those responsibilities and who are willing and able to do it. Now, if you have somebody on your worship team who probably shouldn't be on the worship team, then check out down in the description below the worship team toolkit, where I will give you the code of conduct and the application process that I use for new worship team members at my church. It's everything you need to make sure that you get the right people on your worship team, and you can use that document to re-express the expectations that you have for your teammates to your current team members so that they know what they're actually supposed to be fulfilling. So check that out down in the description below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Till I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.